Why don't you just die already?" Her son, Jason, stood over her like a stranger. Margaret's cheek pressed against the kitchen tile, bleeding, trembling, unseen. His wife looked away. His daughter hadn't called in 5 years. The family she built now stood watching her break. And in that silence, Margaret decided, this ends with me. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The gravy hadn't even cooled when the yelling started. Jason's voice sliced through the hum of forks and half-hearted laughter. "Can you stop dragging your leg? It's like living with a ghost," he muttered, too loud for a whisper but too quiet for an open scolding. Still, everyone heard it. Margaret froze, her fingers trembling slightly around the serving spoon as she passed the sweet potatoes across the table. Candlelight flickered against the walls, illuminating forced smiles and clenched jaws. The turkey, browned and glistening, sat untouched in the center of the table, its steam rising in stubborn defiance. From the far end, Carla laughed nervously and pivoted. "So anyway, I was telling Jason about remodeling the basement. If the old house ever becomes ours officially, I want to put in a wine nook, something cozy, something elegant." Margaret blinked once. She wasn't cold, but she felt the chill anyway. "Officially," Carla had said, as if she wasn't sitting 2 chairs away, her bruised knee swelling under the table. Jason reached for the mashed potatoes and sighed when Margaret tried to help. "For God's sake, just stay seated. You're always in the way." He stood too fast, bumped his chair back. The silverware clattered. And then it happened. As Margaret tried to scoot aside, Jason's arm shot out, not a push in the gentle sense, but a shove designed to erase her. Her slipper caught on the leg of the chair, and her body crumpled downward like a dropped quilt. Her hip struck tile. Her head grazed the wooden island's base with a sickening thunk. Silence. Total, unbearable silence. Someone coughed. The dog whimpered from the hallway. Margaret lay on the floor, her cheek pressed against the cool tile. She didn't move, couldn't. Her ears rang, but Jason's words came through clear, spat like venom. "Why don't you just die already?" The crackling fireplace didn't even pop. She stared up at the ceiling fan above the kitchen, its blades frozen in perfect stillness. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She just breathed, steady and quiet. Nobody helped her up. Even Carla had turned away. 10 minutes later, Margaret rose on her own. She said nothing, wiped her palms on her skirt. She returned to her chair and ate in silence. That night the house creaked under the weight of full bellies and empty apologies. Wind howled outside, shaking the loose siding, and the dishwasher moaned in half cycles. Upstairs, laughter from the TV bled through the walls. Carla's sitcom cackle, Jason's heavy footsteps, the unmistakable sound of a life continuing uninterrupted. But Margaret wasn't sleeping. She stood in the hallway, one hand trailing along the wood-paneled walls until she reached the study. The door was still stiff from disuse. She flicked on the desk lamp, casting shadows across the room. Her late husband's chair still bore the soft indent of his shoulders, though he'd been gone 5 years now. She knelt by the bottom drawer, pulled back the rug, and felt along the corner seam until her fingers met cold metal. The key was hidden behind the drawer's false back, a trick Harold had insisted on for emergencies. Tonight qualified. The lock clicked open, soft and mechanical. Inside lay 2 things: an old .22 pistol wrapped in flannel, and a black binder labeled Family Trust Active. She didn't touch the gun. Her hands curled around the binder, spine creaking as she opened it. Her name was there in full: Margaret Ruth Leland. Beside it, her son's name, Jason Lee Leland, in bold ink. The beneficiary, the inheritor, the heir. Her vision didn't blur, but something behind her chest cracked wide open. Heir to what? Her pain? Her bloodied elbow? Her quiet erasure at a Thanksgiving table she'd set every year since 1982? She flipped the page. There it was. Clause 9.5. The trustee reserves full discretion for asset reallocation at any time prior to the original grantor's passing. Her heart slowed. She read it again. Then she smiled. The first real smile she'd felt in a month, maybe longer. Outside the window, snow began to fall. Quiet, dignified, and unstoppable. And in that quiet, Margaret whispered to the documents in her lap, "Let's see who really dies off first." The next morning, she went to the kitchen and made coffee for herself. The coffee mug shook in Margaret's hand, but not from age. Each sip burned more than the one before. Too hot, too bitter. But she drank it anyway, eyes fixed on the deep scratches etched into the oak dining table. She'd spent decades polishing that wood. Now it caught the light in all the wrong places, just like the bruise swelling under her left collarbone. She sat stiffly in her usual seat, the same one she'd occupied every Thanksgiving, Christmas, and Sunday dinner. But today her presence felt ornamental, like the antique sugar bowl Carla insisted on displaying but never used. Carla bustled around the kitchen in fleece slippers, her voice floating like steam above the clink of dishes. "I've been thinking," she chirped, "once the old house is free, maybe we could finally knock down that awful wall in the den. Open it up, put in quartz countertops, make it less inherited." Jason grunted from the hallway, already halfway through lacing his boots. "We'd have to gut the floors too. Those pine planks are buckling." Margaret didn't flinch. She folded her napkin into fourths, each crease deliberate. "Old house," she echoed softly, more to herself than to them. No one noticed. No one asked how she slept. No one looked close enough to see the thin bruises blooming like ink stains beneath the ivory knit of her sweater. She stood slowly, steadying herself against the table's edge. "I'm going for a walk," she said, voice thin but clear. Carla didn't pause. "Take your cane. You don't want to fall again." Margaret's lips curled slightly. Not a smile. Closer to a twitch. "Don't worry," she replied. "I know the way down." Outside, the air had that post-Thanksgiving stillness, trees stripped bare, sky a slab of dull pewter, the kind of cold that clung to your breath and settled into your bones. She walked slower than usual, but her steps had a quiet certainty. She'd slipped the family binder into her canvas tote before leaving, the same one she'd once used for church knitting groups and co-op potlucks. Now its zipper pressed tightly around deeds, account statements, and a copy of the family trust. Still intact, still untouched, still hers. The law library downtown had grown unfamiliar over the years, sleeker now, flooded with too much fluorescent light and not enough warmth. The front desk assistant barely glanced up when she walked in. She wandered aisle to aisle until she found the section on elder law. Large print, stiff bindings, language too dry to say anything clearly. But then, a voice broke through. "Need help with something, ma'am?" A young woman with a tightly wound bun and tired eyes stood a few feet away, holding a stack of reference books. She couldn't have been older than 22. Margaret hesitated, then said, "I'm looking for something specific." Quietly. They sat in a far corner. Margaret slid the binder across the table, careful not to show the bruise as her sleeve pulled back. "It's a trust," she whispered. "My husband built it. It names my son as beneficiary." The intern, Natalie, her name tag read, flipped through the pages quickly, her expression shifting from polite interest to focused attention. "This clause," Natalie pointed, tapping the document gently. "You're still the grantor. You have full discretion over all disbursements, amendments, even complete reassignment, provided no irrevocable language was used." And it wasn't. Margaret exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible over the hum of overhead lights. "Can someone be removed?" she asked. Natalie nodded. "If you're still alive, they were never entitled, only designated. Alive." Margaret leaned back, letting the words settle in her chest like a warm stone. That's what they'd forgotten. She wasn't gone. She hadn't died. She'd been pushed, but not buried. She pulled a small notebook from her coat pocket and jotted down names in cramped, tidy handwriting. Jason Lee Leland, Carla Ann Leland, Rachel Leland, the last one underlined once. Natalie reached for another book. "Do you want to talk to someone officially? We offer low-cost referrals for estate consultations." Margaret shook her head. "Not yet, but soon." The Florida sun beamed through the glass-paned lanai, casting golden bars across the tile floor. A cat snored from a window perch, oblivious to the sharp tension in the room. On the couch, Miriam wore her reading glasses low on her nose, blinking as she reread the same line on the trust document for the third time. Her voice, usually breezy, came out tight. "He pushed you?" Margaret nodded. She sat stiffly, a throw pillow wedged behind her back where the bruising throbbed. "Near the sink. I landed on the tile." Miriam swallowed hard, her thin fingers tightening around the edge of the folder. "Jesus, Maggie." "It's just Margaret now," she said flatly, sipping cold chamomile tea. The two women had known each other for decades, both former wives, former PTA warriors, and now just women trying to age without being erased. But where Margaret had quietly faded into Ohio's cold corners, Miriam had carved out a retirement in Florida with her laptop, her law license, and a second-hand espresso machine that sputtered like an old man, but still made a hell of a cappuccino. Margaret reached for her tote bag and pulled out the original trust. Its binding was creased, corners curled, a few drops of ancient coffee staining the back page. Walter never wanted Jason to touch a dime unless he earned it. "And he hasn't," Miriam muttered, scanning the names. "So you want to shift full control?" "To Rachel," Margaret said. Miriam looked up, startled. "Rachel? After all these years?" Margaret nodded once. Her voice was calm but clipped. "She stopped talking to me, but she never tried to kill me." Silence hung between them. They hadn't spoken about Rachel in years. The last time her name came up, it was over a Christmas card that went unanswered and a voicemail Margaret never got a reply to. A bitter fight about a forgotten birthday had curdled into 5 years of silence. "She's in Utah, right?" Miriam asked. "Still working hospice?" Margaret gave a small, proud nod. "She's a nurse now, no kids, never married. Do you think she'll want this?" Miriam pressed, gently. "I mean, control of your estate, your medical proxy, everything?" "I'm not giving it to her because she wants it," Margaret said. "I'm giving it to her because she won't use it like a weapon." Miriam took a slow breath and opened her laptop. "All right then, we'll start fresh. No amendments. This'll be a total revocation and reissue, quiet and airtight." The keys clacked methodically. Margaret listened to the tap-tap-tap of her fate being rewritten, each letter erasing the son who shoved her into tile and replacing him with a daughter who once wept on the phone because Margaret hadn't remembered to call. The living trust was redrafted from scratch, every investment account, property deed, and insurance policy redirected. Jason's name was not merely crossed out, it vanished entirely. "Here," Miriam said, sliding the printed pages over. "It's not filed yet. You'll need to sign with a notary. But once it's overnighted back, I'll register everything remotely." Margaret skimmed the pages. Her eyes paused on the newly minted clause. "Successor trustee, Rachel Leland." "Should I tell her?" she asked quietly. Miriam tilted her head. "Do you want to?" "I'll send a letter." Margaret's voice trembled for a fraction of a second. "Not an apology, a door. If she wants to open it, that's hers to choose." Miriam nodded and reached out, resting a warm palm on Margaret's hand. "You're doing something brave." "I'm doing something overdue," Margaret said. "No one writes you into their death while pushing you out of their life." As the printer hummed again and labels were affixed to the overnight envelope, Margaret sat straighter than she had in days. Her spine ached, but her resolve didn't. By sunset, the papers were on their way. The scent of browned butter and cinnamon hung in the air like perfume. Sunlight streamed through the kitchen blinds, cutting sharp angles across the tile. Margaret stood at the stove, flipping pancakes with a practiced wrist, as if the night 2 days ago hadn't happened, like her hip didn't still throb from the bruise beneath her cardigan. Jason wandered in, rubbing sleep from his eyes, hair sticking up like he'd wrestled with nightmares. Carla followed close behind, already talking about resale estimates on the house. Margaret plated golden stacks, dotting them with butter and strawberries. No one commented on the effort, but everyone ate. "Well, this is a surprise," Jason said, mouth half full. "You didn't have to do all this." Margaret smiled gently. "It felt like the right time." Jason gave an awkward shrug. "I've been Stressed. Things got heated. You know how it is. I do, Margaret said softly, pouring more coffee into his mug. It's easy to take stress out on people when you think they'll always stay. He didn't quite meet her eyes. I didn't mean what I said the other night. You said it, she replied. Her voice wasn't sharp, it was factual. A weather report. Carla cleared her throat. Anyway, we've been looking at some great care facilities, near the park, close to that smoothie place you like. Maybe it's time to transition? Just think how peaceful it would be. Peaceful, Margaret echoed, folding her napkin slowly. That does sound nice. Jason perked up, sensing compliance. We can take you on a tour this weekend. If you want, we'll even handle the deposit. I mean, if you could help with it. Of course, Margaret said, with the smile of someone already 10 miles ahead. She cleared the plates while they scrolled on their phones. She didn't say another word as she rinsed the dishes, dried them, and laid her hands flat on the counter like someone saying a quiet goodbye to something invisible. Upstairs, the room felt colder than usual. Her wedding ring sat in its velvet box, undisturbed since the funeral. She lifted it gently, holding it to the light. Then, with one last look at the familiar band of gold, she set it down on her nightstand, facing up, gleaming in the morning light. The duffel bag was small, 2 pairs of pants, a sweater, medication, a well-worn paperback, and the trust documents sealed in a manila envelope. She added a photo of Rachel, years old, faded at the edges, and zipped it shut. Before leaving, she walked into Jason's home office. It still smelled like cologne and printer ink. On his desk, she placed a plain white envelope. Inside was a single yellow post-it with 2 words written in her best cursive, "Call Rachel." She didn't wait for second thoughts. The front door whispered shut behind her. At the Greyhound station, the line was long, filled with bleary-eyed passengers and crying children. Margaret bought a one-way ticket using cash. When the clerk asked if she needed help with her bag, she shook her head. "I've carried heavier things," she murmured. She chose a window seat. As the engine rumbled and the bus hissed into motion, she watched the familiar Ohio streets blur past, laundromats, tire shops, and the park where Jason once pushed Rachel on a swing while Margaret held juice boxes in her purse. Back in the house, Carla walked past Jason's office and paused. "Did you leave something on your desk?" Jason looked up from his phone. "No." She stepped inside, picked up the envelope, and opened it. Her face paled as she held up the post-it. Jason snatched it from her hand. "Call Rachel?" he read aloud. "Why the hell would she—" His voice cut off. For the first time in days, he looked afraid. Rachel turned the letter over twice before opening it. It had arrived without warning, no return address, just her full name in neat black ink. The envelope was heavy in her hands, like whatever was inside already knew it would shift her balance. Inside, a notarized document stamped in Florida, pages thick with clauses and fine print, and on top, a handwritten letter in her mother's slanted cursive. "Rachel, I know I don't deserve this moment, but I'm giving you the future I once promised someone who tried to end mine. I made mistakes. I picked silence when I should have picked you. This is my apology. And your decision." Mom Rachel read the letter 3 times. Her hands trembled. She hadn't spoken to Margaret in 5 years. Not since the screaming match over hospice care for her father, when Margaret had called her selfish and Rachel had walked out with her bags and a vow never to return. She wasn't crying, but her chest felt tight, like the guilt of years had reached across state lines and wrapped around her lungs. The legal documents confirmed it. Margaret had made Rachel the sole trustee of the estate, the power of attorney, the healthcare proxy. Every account, every asset, every remaining sliver of the life Jason assumed would be his. It all now had Rachel's name beside it. She didn't answer the phone when Jason called later that afternoon. Somehow, she knew he knew. Rage travels faster than mail. 2 days later, Rachel stepped off a Greyhound bus into icy Ohio air, suitcase in one hand, letter in the other. She found Margaret at a roadside motel, room 109, its faded numbers barely clinging to the door. Margaret opened it slowly. She looked thinner. Her bruises were yellowing now, blooming under her collar like secrets finally fading. The room smelled like weak coffee and old furniture. But it was neat, controlled, like Margaret herself. Neither woman spoke at first. Then Rachel stepped forward and wrapped her arms around her mother. Margaret didn't hug back immediately, but when she did, her grip was firm, steady. They stood like that for a full minute before Margaret whispered, "You didn't have to come." Rachel pulled back just enough to look her in the eye. "You didn't have to choose me either." They sat on the edge of the bed. Rachel set the legal packet down beside them. "Is it real?" "It's signed, sealed, and already filed," Margaret said. "Jason doesn't know who he's calling anymore." "Why me?" Rachel asked. "After all these years?" Margaret looked at her, calm. "Because you never raised your hand to me, and I'd rather risk regret than give another inch to someone who sees me as a burden." Rachel blinked, tears sliding silently down her cheek. "You should have called sooner. I was waiting to feel strong enough to be worth it." Rachel reached for her mother's hand and held it gently. "Do you want justice or inheritance?" Margaret didn't flinch. "I want him to know I'm not scared of him, but I'm too old to chase revenge for sport." Rachel squeezed her fingers. "Then let me handle the paperwork. You focus on staying upright." Meanwhile, in a sleek suburban office with floor-to-ceiling windows, Jason was pacing. "Try it again," he snapped, jabbing at the bank manager's desk. "I'm sorry, Mr. Whitmore. Your access to these accounts has been revoked." "That's impossible. I'm her only son." The manager offered a brittle smile. "Legally, you're no longer listed anywhere on file. The trustee is Rachel Whitmore." Jason went white. He left the bank in a frenzy, tie flapping over his shoulder, dialing every contact he could think of. Carla didn't answer. His financial advisor hung up after 30 seconds. His sister's number went to voicemail. At home, he slammed a cabinet door and pulled out a bottle of scotch, pouring with a shaking hand. The liquid sloshed over the rim, dripping onto the marble countertop Margaret had once picked out. He took a swig, then threw the glass against the wall. Jason's hand hovered over the payment terminal, his knuckles pale against the plastic. The grocery line behind him was growing restless. Mothers with kids, a teen with headphones, an elderly man clutching a newspaper, but Jason barely noticed. He pressed the card in again, slower this time. Waited, watched, declined. He let out a bitter laugh. "That's gotta be a mistake." The cashier, a college kid with polite dead eyes, avoided his gaze. "Want to try another one?" Jason fished out his backup card. He tapped it, forcing a grin like this was all beneath him. Declined. Again. This time, there was no smile. "What the hell?" he muttered, stepping aside like the counter was contagious. Outside, Carla was waiting in their SUV, scrolling through real estate listings on her phone. He opened the door harder than necessary. "Your card declined," he snapped. "Twice." Carla blinked, then gave a sharp laugh. "What, you think that's funny?" "It's not a joke." She slammed her phone shut. "Jesus, Jason. First Thanksgiving, now this? You're unraveling." "Don't start," he warned. "You shoved your 71-year-old mother," she hissed. "You think that doesn't come with fallout?" Jason stared at her. "She's behind this. Her and Rachel." Carla scoffed. "You sure it's not just your arrogance catching up to you?" He turned away, breathing hard through his nose. The cold air bit his face as he clenched the steering wheel. "I'm not losing control. I'm reclaiming it." That night, Jason called Miriam. "Margaret's lawyer," she answered flatly. "It's Jason," he said, tension bubbling just below the surface. "There's been a mistake. My mother's accounts are locked. I need to see the trust." "You're not on record anymore," Miriam interrupted. Her tone didn't rise or fall. "You don't have access." "What do you mean, I'm not on record? That's my inheritance. That was before you shoved her into a countertop." Jason's stomach sank. "You weren't cut out. You were replaced," she added. "And frankly, after the voicemail you left last week, I wouldn't have waited as long as she did." Jason opened his mouth, but the line clicked off. Silence. Meanwhile, in Utah, Rachel sat in front of her modest laptop, receipts neatly stacked beside her. The cursor blinked on a spreadsheet labeled Mom, Essentials. Margaret's motel had been upgraded to a small furnished condo, walking distance to a public garden and a library. Rent paid through summer. Health insurance premiums, settled, prescription deliveries, arranged weekly. Rachel adjusted her hoodie, cracked her knuckles, and resumed sorting utility payments. Each click was a quiet restoration of dignity, one Margaret hadn't known she was allowed to ask for. Back in Ohio, Jason drove to the family house, tires crunching across frozen gravel. The sun was sinking fast, casting orange slashes across the porch where Margaret used to sit with her tea. He tried the front door, locked. He circled to the back, also locked. All the windows? Latched, covered, distant. The air was still, no light inside, no warmth. Mrs. Gallagher, the elderly neighbor from across the street, peered over her snow-dusted railing. "She moved out weeks ago," she called. Jason turned slowly. "What? Quiet as a ghost," the woman added. "Didn't even say goodbye." He stood there, wind biting through his coat, surrounded by a house that suddenly felt like a memory. He let himself into the garage with an old side key. The place smelled of gasoline and time, dust thick on the workbench, cobwebs in the corners. Inside the house, he flipped on a few lights. Everything was cold, still, silent. He moved like a trespasser now, touching the walls, scanning empty countertops, the worn dip in the recliner cushion. In the kitchen, he opened the fridge out of habit. Inside, there was no food, just a single folded piece of paper taped to the back wall. He pulled it off with trembling fingers, block letters written in sharp black ink. "Not yours anymore." The light in the rec room was gentle, warm, and nothing like the cold edge of the Ohio winter pressing at the windows. Margaret sat in a circle of folding chairs surrounded by women with different stories, but the same tired posture. They were all in transition, some from grief, others from abandonment. One woman had left a violent marriage, another was learning to smile again after decades of silence. Margaret had come at Rachel's urging. "It's just a center, Mom. They have good coffee, maybe even better company." She hadn't expected to speak. She hadn't expected anyone to care. But as introductions made their way around the circle, a volunteer asked if anyone wanted to share what brought them there. Margaret's fingers wrapped tightly around the foam cup. Her bruises had faded, but something colder remained beneath her skin. She cleared her throat. "My name's Margaret. I left home last month. Not the house, the home. There's a difference." A pause. Then, measured calm. "Sometimes the place you raised others in turns into a place where no one sees you anymore. Not really." The room held its breath. "I used to believe dignity was something you had to earn. Now I know it's something you have to protect." One of the women began to quietly cry. Later that afternoon, a local reporter from a small women's magazine approached the center director. She'd heard about the group and wanted to interview someone, preferably one of the elders, for a story on reinvention in late life. The director, still teary from Margaret's group session, asked her to consider a pseudonym. "Not looking for attention," she said, "but her story is something else." Margaret sat down for the interview the next morning. The journalist, a young woman with ink-stained fingers and too many notebooks, leaned forward. "Whatever you're comfortable sharing," she said. So Margaret gave her the cleaned-up version. No names, no bruises, just phrases. A Thanksgiving with tension, a son who forgot kindness, a daughter who remembered it, a woman who walked out of a house and into herself again. They titled the piece, "Second Life, First Time Seen." It went live online 2 days later. Margaret didn't know at first, but Rachel did. "Mom," she said, holding up her phone, "you're kind of a sensation." The article had been reposted by local elder care nonprofits, reshared in caregiving Facebook groups, and highlighted by a national senior wellness page. Comments poured in, many from strangers who saw themselves in Margaret's quiet fire. Margaret blinked at the screen. "I didn't say anything extraordinary." Rachel grinned. "That's the point." In a downtown office tower across the state, Jason sat behind his desk, clicking through his company's Slack feed. A coworker had posted the article with the comment, "This reminds me of that story you told about your mom. Didn't she fall last Thanksgiving?" Jason's face drained of color. Another message popped up. "Wow, hope she's okay. That article hits hard." He minimized the screen and shut the laptop with a snap. His jaw clenched. Something raw and wild flickered behind his eyes. He stood up and paced the length of his office, breathing in short, shallow gulps. Margaret hadn't named him, but it didn't matter. He saw himself between every line. At home that night, Jason sat in front of the television, volume low, a glass of bourbon untouched in his hand. Carla was in the kitchen, silent now, her phone buzzing with yet another shared link to the story. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The headline was carved into his chest. Second Life, First Time Seen. He turned to the dark window. The reflection staring back wasn't the successful sun. It was the man in the background of someone else's triumph. Jason whispered under his breath, voice low, shaking, "She's coming for us." And in the distance, Margaret smiled quietly, reading another email from a stranger who called her brave. The morning began with a sharp rap at the door. Not a knock, a demand. Jason opened it, shirt wrinkled, breath stale from the night before. A man in a postal uniform handed him a large manila envelope. "Jason Kellerman?" "Yeah." "You've been served." Before Jason could form a word, the man was gone, vanishing down the icy steps like the beginning of winter itself. Jason closed the door slowly. His hands trembled, but he ripped the seal open anyway. Across the top, "Notice of civil suit, intentional infliction of emotional distress, filed by Margaret Ann Kellerman, plaintiff representation, Miriam Adler, ESCO." He staggered to the couch and sat, eyes darting across the pages, pulse thudding in his temples. Then his gaze fell to an evidence list. Exhibit A, video footage, Thanksgiving incident, November 23rd. Carla stepped into the living room, clutching her coffee like a life vest. "What is it?" He didn't look up. "She's suing me." Carla blinked. "For what?" Jason dropped the papers on the coffee table. "Emotional distress, abuse. And get this, she's got video." The footage came from Carla's pet cam. It had always been tucked into the corner shelf, meant to keep an eye on their golden retriever. Neither of them had remembered it was rolling that night, but it was, crystal clear. Sound synced, Margaret's shoulder hitting the tile. Jason's snarl, "Why don't you just die already?" The flicker of candlelight, the silence of shame. Carla looking away. By noon, Jason was on the phone with a lawyer friend. "Can I countersue?" The voice on the other end hesitated. "For what?" "I don't know. False claims, defamation, manipulation. She's setting me up." There was a long pause. Then, "Jason, Ohio has strict elder abuse protections. If that video's legit, you don't have a defense. You have a problem." Jason slammed the phone down so hard the glass of water on the side table tipped and shattered. Carla cornered him that afternoon while folding laundry. "She's not bluffing. You think that article didn't mean anything? She's laying bricks." Jason leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "She's going to drain us," Carla snapped. "If this goes to trial, we're going to lose everything." "She won't take me down," Jason muttered. "She already has. The video's out. Her lawyer's filing motions. Your name's dirt." He stood, fists clenched. "She started this war." Carla's voice cracked. "And what if she finishes it in a courtroom, with you on the stand looking like the ungrateful son who shoved his 71-year-old mother to the floor? You think that's a win?" Jason's silence said enough. She looked at him, disgusted. "You don't need a lawyer, you need a mirror." That evening, Jason opened his inbox to find another blow. Subject line, R.E. Temporary Protective Order, Rachel Kellerman. His sister had filed a restraining order, effective immediately. No contact allowed, no proximity permitted. Jason threw the laptop against the couch cushions and screamed into his hands. His family was closing ranks. His name was being scrubbed off more than just bank accounts. It was being erased from legacy, protection, memory. Across town, Margaret sipped hot tea in her modest rental, watching the snow flurry against the darkening window. Rachel sat across from her, typing a follow-up email to Miriam. "You ready for the backlash?" she asked. Margaret didn't flinch. "It's already been delivered." Rachel hesitated. "Do you want to know what he said?" Margaret looked at her daughter, the only person in her life now who saw her not as a weight, but a woman. "No," she said quietly. I remember what he said the first time. The cursor blinked back at Jason like it was daring him. He stared at the spreadsheet Miriam had once accidentally emailed him years ago, a dusty corner of family finances he had kept in a private folder. Line 46, KMGT Revocable Account. He'd always assumed it was a backup trust. Margaret never mentioned it. It hadn't moved in years. And right now, he needed funds. With trembling fingers and a half-empty bottle of bourbon beside him, Jason clicked transfer funds. He moved $68,300 into his own joint checking account. He hit submit. Approved. A bitter smile tugged at his lips. "Checkmate, old woman," he muttered. 2 days later, a letter arrived. Not from a lawyer, not from Rachel, from the Internal Revenue Service. Jason tore it open, his eyes scanning furiously until his knees buckled and he dropped into the kitchen chair. "You are being audited under suspicion of unauthorized access and fraudulent withdrawal from a bait account monitored under Title 26. Jason reread the word bait 3 times. Margaret had planted it. It was never real money, just a breadcrumb for a desperate thief. And he bit. Carla walked in as he buried his face in his hands. "What now?" she asked, exhausted. Jason tossed the letter across the table. "She set me up." Carla read it, jaw tightening. "This is federal, Jason." "I'll fix it." "Number you won't," she said softly, eyes glassy. "You're unraveling." And she's watching every thread snap. Meanwhile, in Utah, Rachel sat on a muted Zoom call with the county clerk's office. "Yes, I'd like to block any attempts to authorize property tax transfers or ownership change on file 302KS. The woman on the other end blinked. "We actually just received an online attempt from Jason Kellerman." Rachel exhaled slowly, expression unreadable. "Then please consider this the formal revocation." "Confirmed," the woman said. Rachel leaned back in her chair, eyes closed for a moment. Jason's spiral accelerated like a truck without brakes. He started calling Rachel's phone every other night. The voicemails were slurred, sometimes apologetic, sometimes venomous. "You were always her favorite. You think you're better than me? You weren't even around." Another message. "You don't get to rewrite history, Rachel." And another. "You think I'm afraid of you two? I built this house while she rotted." Rachel never responded. She just forwarded them all to Margaret and clicked save. Margaret listened with unblinking calm as Rachel played the most recent message. His voice cracked in rage. "You don't win, Mom. I'll burn the whole damn estate before I let you hand it over." Margaret sipped her tea, chamomile, steady hands, unfazed. She looked at Rachel. "He's done." Back in Ohio, Carla's quiet panic took form in browser tabs. Apartment listings, Section 8 wait lists. She left the screen open once. Jason saw it. "Looking for a roommate?" he barked. She didn't flinch. "Looking for a life raft." They didn't sleep in the same bed that night. Or the next. Margaret sat at her motel desk, illuminated by the soft yellow glow of a desk lamp. In front of her, a file labeled Trial Preparation. Tabs lined the sides in a rainbow of categories: audio, financial, video, healthcare. She picked up a pen, clicked it once, and began annotating. Rachel sat across from her with her laptop. "Want me to call Miriam?" Margaret didn't look up. "Number, I've got this part." Her hand moved with sharp purpose, writing in clean block letters on the inside cover, "I will not be buried quietly." At 2:43 a.m., Jason stood alone in the kitchen, empty bottle in hand, pacing. His phone buzzed, an email from Adler Law. Subject, court date set, March 11th. Elder abuse case, Kellerman vs. Kellerman. Jason stared at the screen, his mouth twisted into a snarl. Then he whispered, "She really wants war?" From the shadows behind him, Carla's voice came quietly. "No, Jason. She wants you to lose." The courthouse smelled faintly of lemon polish and aging books, a scent that clung to dignity and finality. Margaret sat still in her wheelchair, her hands resting in her lap like folded silk. Her cane leaned against the armrest, a pale scarf wrapped gently around her neck, hiding what time had not erased, faded bruises like old memories. Rachel stood beside her, spine straight, chin high. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. Across the aisle, Jason stumbled into the room in a wrinkled charcoal suit that hung off his shoulders like he'd borrowed it from a man who used to believe in himself. His tie was askew, his shoes were scuffed, his eyes bloodshot. He had no lawyer. The clerk called, "Kellerman v. Kellerman, civil matter, elder protection statute." The judge entered. Margaret didn't flinch when the footage began. The room dimmed as the screen flickered to life. Carla's pet cam footage, recovered, enlarged. Thanksgiving, candlelight, clinking forks, muffled arguments. Then the moment. Jason's voice snarled, "Why don't you just die already?" The push, the fall. A gasp rippled through the courtroom. A juror covered her mouth. One of the reporters dropped his pen. Margaret remained still. Jason shifted in his seat, then stood. "That wasn't how it happened, The judge held up a hand, firm and sharp. "Mr. Kellerman, you'll wait to be addressed." Jason's mouth twitched shut. Margaret was sworn in. Her voice didn't tremble. It didn't rise. It didn't need to. "I was raised in a generation that fought wars," she said, gaze steady on the jury. "We rationed butter. We buried sons. We fixed what broke. I never imagined my last battle would be with my own child." She turned slightly toward Jason. "But survival, it runs deeper than blood." The room didn't breathe. Jason's rebuttal was limp. "She's lying. This is all about money. She turned my sister against me. Mr. Kellerman," the judge cut in again, colder this time, "you do not have the right to frame abuse as inheritance envy." Jason's jaw clenched, but he said nothing more. After closing remarks, the jury deliberated for less than an hour. Margaret didn't move. She didn't blink. Her hands still folded. The verdict was read aloud. In favor of Margaret Kellerman, Jason was ordered to pay $37,000 in restitution, barred from contesting the trust or future estate matters, and sanctioned with a permanent record of elder mistreatment under the Adult Protective Statutes of Ohio. He didn't look shocked. He looked hollowed out. Outside, light poured through the tall courtroom windows like forgiveness. Margaret reached for her cane and stood slowly, Rachel helping her balance. Jason didn't look at her. He stared at the ground, unmoving. She didn't gloat. She didn't flinch. She simply turned her head, met Rachel's eyes, and gave her a small nod. It was not victory. It was release. The key turned, but the lock barely gave. Jason shoved harder, shoulder grinding against the doorframe until it creaked open. He stepped into silence. Heavy, biting silence. Not just quiet. Absence. The air inside the house had gone stale, holding none of the warmth it once had. It smelled faintly of old wood, dryer sheets, and abandonment. The lights didn't flicker on when he hit the switch. The power was out. A thin shaft of dusk filtered in through slanted blinds, casting angled shadows across a living room that looked paused. He dropped his bag by the door, the thud echoing louder than it should have. "Carla?" he called, already knowing there'd be no answer. The fridge was empty. Not just food, empty. The shelves had been scrubbed bare. Cabinets gaped open, half a drawer still dangling loose like someone had pulled it with too much rage or too much resolve. His mouth went dry. In the center of the kitchen counter, a single sheet of paper sat beneath a coffee mug. Carla's handwriting was sharp, familiar. "I married a man, not a monster." See Jason's breath caught. He stared at the note for a long, long time, then balled it in his fist and threw it hard against the fridge, where it bounced back without sound. Room by room, the house whispered betrayal. Closet hangers swung empty. Bathroom drawers were bare. A few of his shirts were left behind, folded wrong, like Carla didn't care if they wrinkled. In their bedroom, the mattress was stripped, and the side of the bed she slept on had a dent still pressed into it, like she'd sat for a moment before rising, deciding. No arguments. No ultimatums. Just gone. Jason let out a low growl as he knocked a lamp off the nightstand. The ceramic shattered. He didn't flinch. Upstairs, the attic steps creaked under his weight. The dust was undisturbed, except for one set of recent footprints. Carla had been up here. Why? He scanned the space, old boxes, tax files, Christmas ornaments, and then he saw them, 2 cardboard cartons labeled Jason, age 7 to 10, and school projects. His throat tightened. Inside, crayon drawings curled with age, stick figures with exaggerated smiles, drawn family dinner, and stars labeled World's Best Mom. Then one, a small construction paper cutout of a cape and crown, in crooked blue ink, Mom's Hero. Jason stared at it for a moment too long. The paper shook in his hands. Then he tore it, first in half, then again, and again, until only shredded scraps fell through his fingers like confetti from a funeral. Outside, the wind had picked up, and the trees rustled like they knew something he didn't. Jason stepped onto the porch and sat heavily on the top stair, eyes glassy, legs spread wide. Footsteps approached. He didn't turn. "Rough day?" a familiar voice said. He looked up. It was Mr. Halverson from next door, retired Army, early riser, slow walker, never missed garbage day. Jason gave a bitter laugh. "You could say that." Halverson squinted at him for a beat, then nodded toward the house. "She deserved better. Margaret, so did your wife, I'd guess." Jason opened his mouth, but no words came. Halverson tipped his cap and walked off without waiting for a reply. Jason sat there until the sun dipped below the roofs, until the cold finally settled in his bones. The note was still in the fridge. The lights still wouldn't turn on. The hero he once drew no longer existed, even in memory. Margaret stood in front of the sliding glass doors of Rachel's condo in Utah, the view stretching wide and uninterrupted. Miles of amber-red rock and soft whispering sage. The air here was different, lighter. It carried no memories, just breathe. Rachel handed her a cup of tea. "It's chamomile, calms the heart." Margaret took it wordlessly. Her knuckles were still stiff from the cold of Ohio, but they no longer trembled. She sipped, watching the horizon melt into a dusty blush. "You really want me here? Permanently?" Rachel didn't hesitate. "I wouldn't have asked if I didn't mean it." Margaret let the silence stretch before she answered. "I'm not who I was." Rachel's voice was soft, steady. "Neither am I. But we're still here." 3 weeks later, Margaret had a new routine. Slow mornings, afternoon walks through the neighborhood trails. In the evenings, she volunteered at the local hospice, folding linens, organizing care kits, sitting beside those who had no one left to sit beside them. "Just be present," the nurse supervisor had told her. "That's the most valuable thing." And she was. She sat through stories and silence, through final breaths and reluctant goodbyes. She learned how to comfort without solving, how to witness pain without absorbing it. One day she returned home to find Rachel at the dining table, a small stack of papers between them. Trust documents, revised, updated, typed in crisp legal font. Rachel pushed them forward. "I added the hospice to the charitable beneficiaries, but I left a section blank, just in case." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "A blank clause?" Rachel nodded. "For whatever you want it to say, not money." Just meaning Margaret stared at the space. She thought of everything lost and everything gained. Slowly, she picked up a pen and wrote, "No one should ever die without being seen." Rachel leaned in to read it, then placed her hand gently over her mother's. "That's the best clause in the whole thing." That night, Margaret sat on the porch, pen in hand again. A letter rested on her lap, addressed to Jason. She'd written it and rewritten it. Apology, explanation, regret, pain. And still, every sentence felt insufficient or too much. She read it one last time, folded it, held it over the porch lantern flame. The paper curled and blackened. Words dissolved. The envelope fell in on itself like a lung deflating. She watched it burn to nothing. Rachel stepped outside with 2 mugs in hand. "Cold's rolling in," Margaret nodded. "Good. I want to feel it." Later, Rachel found Margaret sitting with a photo album, one Rachel hadn't seen in years. Inside were only a handful of pictures: Margaret's wedding, baby Jason, a vacation in the Smokies, Rachel's college graduation. Margaret pointed to a photo of them both, one Rachel had forgotten existed. "This was the last time we laughed without reservation." Rachel looked down at it. "We'll find our way back." Margaret closed the album. "Number will build forward. There's nothing back there I need anymore." The next morning, Margaret called the hospice director and asked if she could train to sit with the actively dying. The ones most volunteers were too scared to stay with. She said yes. "You sure about this?" Rachel asked later over breakfast. "I spent too many years being invisible," Margaret replied. "If I can keep someone from feeling like that in their final breath, then that's how I'll earn the rest of my life." The op-ed went live at 6:07 a.m. on a Tuesday. By 6:42, it had over 300 shares. By noon, it was on the front page of 2 elder justice newsletters, and a quote from it had already been turned into an Instagram reel by a caregiving advocate. "Love shouldn't come with bruises and ultimatums." Rachel had titled it, "When Family Fails You, You Still Deserve to Win." And under that title sat Margaret's story, unfolded not as a tale of vengeance, but a survival blueprint. Sanitized names, sharpened truths. Margaret read the piece 3 times in a single sitting, then once again with her tea in hand. It was strange, seeing her wounds turned into sentences. Stranger still to realize they were being read by strangers. That afternoon, her inbox flooded. Retired teachers, widowed mothers, forgotten grandfathers. Some typed long, heartbreaking essays of their own. Others sent 2-word messages that hit harder than most. "Thank you. Finally heard." She responded to everyone. Meanwhile, across the country in a sports bar in Dayton, Jason stared at a muted television mounted above a row of beer taps. There she was, her face, his mother. The segment was brief, just 2 minutes on a national news clip referencing elder protection reform and how one woman's courage sparked a broader conversation. But Jason didn't need volume to understand what was being said. The bartender glanced at the screen, then at Jason. "Hey, you related to her?" Jason didn't blink. "Not anymore." The bartender gave a slow nod and wiped down the counter, saying nothing else. But the silence had a weight to it. Back in Utah, Margaret prepared for the podcast interview. Rachel adjusted the mic on her collar, smoothing down a strand of silver hair, as if preparing her for something larger than a conversation. Something permanent. "You sure you're ready for this?" Rachel asked. "I've been ready for a while," Margaret replied. "Just never had the mic." The recording started in a modest studio downtown. No fancy green room, just a circle of 3 chairs, 1 host, and 2 mugs of coffee that steamed while the past was unboxed. The interviewer was gentle but direct. "What do you say to people who think you've gone too far by removing your son from your life?" Margaret inhaled slowly. The foam of her latte trembled slightly in her hands. "I say survival doesn't always come in a clean package. Sometimes it's paperwork. Sometimes it's an exit. Was there ever a moment where you doubted the decision?" She looked toward the small window where the winter light poured in, muted and pale. "I doubted if I'd make it out of that house, but not once did I doubt what had to be done after." The host leaned forward. "What do you want others to take from your story?" Margaret gave a soft smile, her eyes crinkling but not watering. "I'm not a victim," she said. "I'm a chapter closer to peace." The room was quiet for a full beat. No follow-up, just truth, hovering heavy in the air. As the recording wrapped, Margaret stood slowly, rolling her shoulders like a woman finally stepping out of a cast. 2 days later, the world tilted sideways in Margaret's kitchen. It started with a flicker, a strange fuzziness behind her left eye. Then came the numbness, slow and creeping, dragging down her left arm like wet laundry on a sagging line. Her mug slipped from her fingers and shattered on the floor. She didn't fall this time, but the silence afterward roared in her ears like a wave retreating from shore. She managed to press the emergency alert necklace she swore she'd never wear. By the time the paramedics arrived, the snow had just started falling outside. Light flakes caught in the porch light like ash. Her breath fogged up the oxygen mask as the gurney rolled across the threshold. The neighbor's Christmas lights blinked mockingly cheerful as she was lifted into the ambulance. Rachel arrived within the hour. No hesitation, no confusion, just muscle memory guiding her through hospital corridors, clipboard clutched tight to her chest, her ID badge already flipped to show staff who she was. When she entered the recovery room, Margaret was awake, pale, and tethered to a web of blinking monitors. Her left hand twitched slightly when Rachel touched it. "You didn't have to come," Margaret whispered. Rachel shook her head. "I didn't come. I ran." They sat in soft silence, broken only by the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor and the distant chime of a cart being wheeled past the room. Then Margaret's voice cut through the hush like a thread snapping under tension. "Promise me you'll never become him." Rachel froze, eyes stinging before she could blink it back. "I'm not," she said gently. "And your story is why I became a nurse, remember? To make sure no one else ends up invisible." Margaret let out a faint chuckle, the kind that sounded more like a breath escaping than amusement. "Invisible's one thing, forgotten is another." Rachel reached into her purse and pulled out a folded envelope. "I was going to give this to you next week, but maybe now's better." Inside was a printed certificate, a formal statement of fund establishment in Margaret's name, the Fair Endowment, for elder care workers and advocacy scholarships. Margaret traced the ink with her fingers. Her eyes didn't tear, but they softened, like a curtain drawing open to let in morning light. "I've already gifted you half the inheritance," she said after a long pause, "before the lawyers could talk me out of it." Rachel swallowed. "Why now?" Margaret looked out the window, where snow was beginning to gather along the windowsill. The world outside was blanketed in soft white, the kind of quiet that felt holy, like forgiveness. "Because love," she said, "isn't something you wait to give until you're gone." Rachel blinked fast, lips pressed tight, her knuckles whitening on the side rail. "I don't care about the money." "I know you don't," Margaret said, meeting her gaze. "That's why you're the only one who ever deserved it." A moment passed, then another. Margaret turned her face toward the ceiling, her voice a murmur barely louder than the whisper of wind outside. "You gave me something your brother never could. Hope." Outside, the snow kept falling, fine and steady, like time in reverse. A nurse stepped in, clipboard in hand, asking softly if it was okay to dim the lights. Rachel nodded, brushing a strand of hair from Margaret's temple. "Let her rest. She's earned it." At the attorney's office, the pen glided across the thick cream-colored paper with an elegance that belied the weight of what it sealed. Margaret leaned slightly over the polished oak table, her hands steady despite the tremor that occasionally shook them when she was tired. The attorney across from her nodded once. Rachel stood beside her, a quiet pillar, her eyes not on the documents, but on her mother's face. "Is this what you want?" the attorney asked gently. Margaret didn't hesitate. "It's what's already true. I'm just making it official." The final version of her will, pristine and legally bulletproof, lay completed and notarized. Jason was removed. Forever. No caveats, no residual clauses. The language was clear. This estate recognizes only love freely given and respect not begged for. She handed the sealed folder to Rachel, who cradled it like something sacred. Margaret took a breath that felt like the first one in years. The senior community in Parkview Gardens wasn't flashy or ostentatious. That was the appeal. It was quiet, clean, warm in the ways that mattered. Sunlight through floor-to-ceiling windows, staff who remembered your name, and residents who didn't care about the past because they were all writing their final chapters with dignity. Margaret moved in without ceremony. No announcements, no "look at me." Just a single overnight bag and a box of hard-won wisdom. Her new apartment was modest, but hers. The walls were painted a soft, eggshell blue, the furniture simple. On the nightstand sat a single framed photograph, Margaret and Rachel, standing on the courthouse steps, Rachel's arm wrapped tight around her shoulders, both women looking like they'd survived fire and built a home from its ashes. Nothing else from her old life made the cut. By the third week, Margaret had already made a name for herself, not because of her story, but because of her voice. She began teaching a weekly workshop in the community center, mostly women, a few men, some walking with canes, others rolling in on scooters, all of them leaning in with a hunger that had nothing to do with age. The class was called Protecting Yourself with Power. It wasn't about a state law alone. It was about voice, about naming your worth while you were still alive, about not apologizing for outliving people's patience. Don't wait to be seen, she told them. They don't get to write your ending. The participants nodded, scribbled notes, asked questions that spilled into lunch hours. One woman clutched Margaret's hand after class and whispered, "You gave me permission. I didn't know I needed it." Margaret squeezed back. "You always had it. You just needed to hear it out loud." That evening, after class, she stepped out into the garden. The air was crisp. Winter's edge hovered in the twilight, and her breath formed little clouds in front of her face. A row of fairy lights blinked along the walkway, glowing against the darkening sky. Somewhere nearby, someone was playing an old Sinatra tune on a Bluetooth speaker. She walked alone. Not lonely, just alone. Her coat pulled close, her cane tapping rhythmically against the stone path. As she reached the gate, she turned, looked up at the sky flecked with stars, and whispered, "I made it." Not with fanfare, not with revenge sung in headlines, but with quiet completion. Her justice didn't end in the courtroom. It lived in every boundary reclaimed, every voice she helped sharpen, every woman who now knew she didn't have to wait for permission to fight back. Inside her coat pocket, she carried one last item, a folded sheet of paper, the original trust, annotated, redlined, rewritten over time and pain. She paused, took it out, and tore it neatly down the middle. No need to look back.